Did Robert Farquharson commit one of the most appalling crimes in Australian history by deliberately driving his 3 sons into a dam on Father's Day in 2005? Or has Australia once again wrongly imprisoned an innocent parent for the accidental death of their children? This is a question I've been asking myself for the past 8 years, and this year I decided to try and find some answers. I became involved in the case when I was working with a journalist on a different story, and he, as a law student, had formed the view that Robert Farquharson was innocent. And he came to me and he said, "I think he's innocent." And I said, "Well, I, like most other people, think he's guilty." At the heart of this story is a tragedy, the deaths of 3 young children. It devastated their families and affected the whole community. But mourning those deaths shouldn't prevent us from having a hard look at the evidence that saw their father convicted and sentenced to 33 years for their murder. This case is fascinating to me because there's at least 6 strands of circumstantial evidence that led to the conviction of Robert Farquharson. But I think there are serious questions to be asked of all 6 strands about whether they are sufficient, either individually or together, to convict a man. I found problems with numerous of the strands of the evidence. One of the things that Robert Farquharson said had happened was that he coughed and blacked out and the car had gone into the dam while he was unconscious. Obviously he can't be guilty if that's the case. The expert in the trials said this was a vanishingly rare likelihood that he'd done this. But quite a good deal of evidence has since emerged that cough syncope, as it's called, is not as rare as that expert pointed out, and that Robert Farquharson was a candidate for that given his physical size, the fact he had a chest infection, the fact that he was a smoker. And so that's one of the strands that I think deserves another look. Another key strand of evidence that convicted him was evidence that the police produced an experiment of how a car would sink into the water of the dam. But that experiment was done in a dam that was significantly shallower than the actual dam that Robert Farquharson's car went into. And the experiment was done, videotaped, shown to the jury in conditions that were quite different. The door of Robert Farquharson's car was opened because he got out of it. That causes a car to sink like a stone, and evidence produced since his trials has demonstrated that. But that evidence was not really taken into account by the juries in his trials. They are 2 examples of the kinds of things that we found in this investigation. I started to question his guilt really when I started to tease apart those strands of evidence. This is called a strands of the rope case. That's the legal term. It's essentially that no single strand is necessarily enough to convict somebody, but woven together they make a case that's strong enough. But if you start picking away at those strands, unravelling them, seeing where the flaws are and seeing that there are significant flaws, you begin to wonder if the rope itself is strong enough to sustain a conviction. And that's the project I've been on during the investigation for this, is to really try and understand each of the strands and whether they are strong enough to form part of that rope. This case has got a lot of similarities with the cases of Lindy Chamberlain and Kath Folbig. For one thing, one of the key strands of evidence against Robert Farquharson was how he behaved after the crash, on the side of the dam and in police interviews that night. And what police found out of that and what the public saw out of that was how oddly he had behaved. And that, I think, was a significant contributor to the narrative around him being guilty. You see that replicated very closely in both the Folbig case and the Chamberlain case. In Folbig, there was no scientific evidence to convict her. Really, the main strand of evidence that got her was her diaries, where she'd written these strange things about the children leaving her and so forth. And it wasn't until those diaries were reinterpreted as a guilty, grieving mother who couldn't explain the loss of her children, an innocent explanation, that her conviction was finally overturned last year. Lindy Chamberlain, in her case, her husband Michael was walking around the campsite saying to people, really very shortly after the baby had disappeared in the jaws of a dingo, saying things like, "She's 9 months old, she's probably dead by now." Then there was the question of whether Lindy smiled enough or didn't smile enough or cried or looked emotional. And those things were extremely important both in the public debate and in the prosecution. That sort of demeanour evidence in the past has been used against people, just as it was in the Farquharson case, but it doesn't take into account how much trauma and the loss of a child, for example, can affect your behaviour and make you do things that to outside eyes look odd and abnormal and possibly guilty. I found podcasting just an extraordinary medium for telling this story. You've got length, you've got this ability to explore an issue from various sides, including nuance, and most importantly, we've got access to material that nobody outside the courtroom has ever heard before. We've got the secret recordings that police took when they tapped Robert Farquharson's phone in the weeks after the tragedy. We've got his interviews that he did with police.
Can I ask one question? Yeah, mate, you can ask any question. I've never ever been in trouble before, so what's the likely scenario for me? Well, mate.
We've got the recordings that were made by a friend of his going in to try and entice him into a confession.
To me, Rob, you said to me, "I'll finish the day about dreams. I have an accident, survive it." No, they don't. That's what you said to me.
I never said that.
We've got the 000 call that Cindy Gambino, the mother of the 3 children, made from the side of the dam on the night of the crash.
How did your husband get out of the car?
I don't know. How did you get out of the car, Rob? He woke up in the water. He tried to get the kids out.
These things really give people the richest idea that they probably would ever have had of the kind of evidence that was brought to bear in this case, and the movement, the sounds of people's voices, all the things that are played in a courtroom that the general public just doesn't get to hear. And really the only way of conveying all those things is through the medium of a podcast. For the full story, you can read Good Weekend, you can listen to our 5-part podcast, Trial by Water, or you can watch 60 Minutes, which also covers the story.